Ramesh Srinivasan is a professor at the University of California, where he studies and teaches about the relationship between technology, politics, and society. While we think of platforms such as Twitter and Facebook as open and accessible to all, in reality they are commercial entities developed primarily by and for the Western world. Considering how new technologies increasingly shape labor, economics, and politics, these tools often reinforce the inequalities of globalization, rarely reflecting the perspectives of those at the bottom of the digital divide. It's really important to understand how the design of the tools we use every day is biased, for us to reflect on the impact it already has on our lives and societies. It's probably more important that we want to acknowledge as information how we make and what we make of it is what shapes today and tomorrow. So there you go. This episode is just a quick introduction to these notions. I really hope you will enjoy it.
Technologies are never neutral. Science itself is not neutral. And we create technologies and scientific instruments in our image based on who we are. False but also sensationalist information becomes the norm.
Hello, Ramesh.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Thanks a lot for taking the time to come and have some conversation with me. To give you some background, I love to understand before anything when I meet someone. I love to understand where people are speaking from. What are the glasses they are using to look at the world, right? So on your internet page, it says that you explore technology, politics, and culture across the world. Can you please tell me a bit more about why this exploration is important to you and what it says about your worldview to start with?
Oh, we're at a very interesting time right now where we see technologies that are created in very small parts of the world, right? In Silicon Valley, in Seattle, also in China, that are now in the hands of billions of people. So what that means is when a few people create technologies, right, that become the tools for billions, there's going to be questions of how are those tools, how are those systems impacting people's lives in ways that were not anticipated and that are far removed, right? Very different than the lives of those who created those systems. So it's a question that I'm super interested in because the internet itself and digital technology and mobiles, it's not just about a website. It's not just about blockchain. It's not just about a social media platform. It's everything, right? The language and the models of digital computation, of AI systems, of data, it's informing the internet, everything we know, right? And this is something we all are increasingly realizing, from our cities to our objects, even people, in their minds in a way. So this is having and will continue to have incredibly transformative impacts on our traditional systems of being as human beings. Our minds, our hearts, our societies, our economics, our politics, but also our cultures and traditions and values. So I'm a former engineer, but I became so interested in this theme in exploring what these technologies mean in the lives of actual people across the world, right? In a real way, like how are people actually shaping and being shaped by these technologies, and what alternatives might exist for them?
Okay, so I'd like to explore, concrete examples on how that technology, is actually impacting society, culture, and governments. So we can go through maybe these different points. First, can we define the type of technology we're talking about? Because technology is such a big word. And so, what is the tech or the set of tech that is defining the most our times, and shaping the future, and maybe why it's different from the tech before?
Yeah, great question. So technology actually can be almost anything, right? It's an expression of the human mind, but it's also an expression of the poetics and the heart. Techne is a term that comes out of Greek, and it's actually a term that Martin Heidegger said represents not just the cognitive and rational mind, but the poetic and aesthetic mind. So we create technologies of all forms in our image as human beings. So the reason why these technologies that I'm speaking about, specifically the digital technologies, the internet technologies, are so powerful is because they have an incredible ability to spread rapidly and to actually learn from and gather and, in a sense, collect and also, in a sense, surveil people, right? So that means these technologies are very different than traditional technologies, right? So like the printing press, for example, or the written word, those are technologies as well. But those are technologies where you can author something and it spreads. But in this particular case, we're speaking about technologies that are also learning from you. They're interactive in this way. So they have a capacity built into them that we've never seen before in any kind of technology, right? And that's why this is very powerful. The digital is the brain, it's the machine, it's almost everything, right? It's more than anything, it's kind of it's a way of informing and infusing logic and value into almost every object and thing. And I'm going to give you some specific examples, I'm sure, in a moment. Yeah.
So we have now over half of the world population on the internet, right? Most of them being also on social media and connecting with the phone every day. So what's going on online, it basically is really, as you said, shaping our lives and also how the world functions. So what is important to understand about how this technology work, where they come from, and again, like who gets to decide how they're impacting each other? You mentioned that they all come from the same place, but can we develop on that that we're clear on that?
So, what we're seeing is as technologies leave Silicon Valley and they travel to the far reaches of the world, the biases, right? Like the value systems, the ways of not just the business models, but also the cultural models end up influencing the experiences of people far away in the world. So I'll give you many examples of this, right? So one example is in Myanmar, right? Recently, there was a genocide against the Rohingya Muslim people, right? But Facebook made the mistake of designating the Rohingya people, a Rohingya, human rights basically group, as a terrorist group, and designated the Burmese military as a legitimate group. And so what Facebook essentially did is completely shaped and transformed the media news cycle outside of Burma, not because they were bad intentioned, but because they were ignorant. Right?
When you say the design, is the algorithm doing it, or there's someone actually
it's actually
deciding?
Like a policy framework, right? And that's because a lot of the tech companies, those running the policy, those thinking about governance issues around the technology, and I'm not trying to blame them for it, but it's a natural issue, are culturally and globally ignorant. Another example, I gave this earlier today.
And they all come from the same cultural
Precisely.
background.
So here, give you an even more intense example. Facial recognition systems have been taking the faces of Serena Williams, Michelle Obama, Oprah, all very powerful and influential, inspiring in many cases, Black women. And every one of these systems, including the Chinese facial recognition systems, are thinking that they're men. And they don't seem to be able to learn that these are women. So why is that happening? It's because the people building those systems may not account for maybe Black women, because they don't tend to be Black women building these systems. They tend to be white and male, sometimes Asian and male. That doesn't make them bad people. It means they're not considering all the parameters and variables. And how can you, right? How can you consider specificities of the Rohingya when I'm building a technology like in Sunnyvale, California, or Mountain View, California for Google, right? So that's why we, more than anything, need to ensure that those voices that drive the digital revolution are democratic and representative of the global population of their users. And there's a lot of things we can do. We can consult people, we can audit systems, we can ensure that systems really work by scaffolding them. We can think about the values, what kind of technologies are going to serve the wider world, as well as business, and design that into the blueprints. But part of the key with technology is you don't let it run like crazy without really carefully seeing what it does in people's lives and giving them some power and control over it as well.
Which is what's happening kind of today, right? Like it's not neutral, and people that are building this technology don't even acknowledge that it's actually not neutral sometimes, because they have this bias at the root of what they do, which is our worldview and it's fine, right?
Technologies are never neutral. Science itself is not neutral, right? I mean, we've seen, for example, science means well. Technologists mean well, but they are always none of us are neutral, right? And we create technologies and scientific, instruments in our image based on who we are, right? And our agendas and our ways of looking at things. Of course, someone like me even, I'm not deeply informed by a feminist consciousness, right? I'm not deeply informed by the realities and values of people in Africa who represent the largest growth of internet users in the world, the youngest population in the world, the fastest growing population in the world, the places where the internet is most rapidly expanding. How can I, as an Indian man from Silicon Valley, really know this? But I don't have to know this deeply. What I have to do is collaborate and work with people and respect them and not think that I'm some heroic auteur, like solving people's problems. That's when the hubris and the ego comes in, and that's what we got to avoid.
Okay. Well, we'll get a little bit more into that, but I'd like to get more example maybe on what is the impact of, so that everyone gets it, and what is the impact of tech on how people behave in general, and also on our culture. Because again, I don't think we often realize what's going on here because it's beyond our conscious understanding sometimes.
Yeah. The impacts are both individual and behavioral and psychological, but they're also social and systemic in the sense of like the Rohingya example, impacting political systems, economic systems. But on the interpersonal behavioral level, I'll give you a very simple example. About 96% or so of time, maybe 95% of time, people don't go to page 2 of their Google search results. Yeah. Over 70% of the time, people don't click on anything past their first 3 of their search results. So what that means is people simply trust what Google shows to them. So this is an example, right? Now, that's fine, but we don't even know why we see what we see. We just take what is presented to us as truth. And that's going to have a massive impact on people's behavior because what people know is dependent on what invisible black box systems show them, right? That's one example, right? Another example, which might be more psychological, maybe you're interested in it, is we're finding that, that the kinds of communication with our youth, our younger people, with texting, Snapchatting, Instagramming, it's good for communication, but it's not good for the deep connection that people need when they're younger to build relationships. LOL, this kind of thing. It's quick, but it's not deep. It's not reflective. It's not foundational, right? So we actually see, unfortunately, amongst younger people, teenagers, increased smartphone usage as positively correlated to depression. Another issue, of course, is the ADD, like people are just overwhelmed with information, and that's why they trust systems like Google. So these are very interpersonal, psychological, behavioral impacts of technology. But as I was trying to say, when they're embedded in societies, especially far removed from the places where the technologies are created by almost completely private companies, despite the internet being publicly funded, it's very important to know. It has profound impacts on political systems. I'll give you an example from the United States. On Facebook, before our election in 2016, the most trafficked, the most circulated news source on Facebook was Breitbart News, which is extreme right-wing, like Marine Le Pen here, right? And this news source is full of basically racist ideas. At times, it's completely wrong and false. How did this become the most visible news source? And the reason why is because the algorithmic systems that power technologies, from YouTube's recommendation system to what Facebook makes visible, is based on one primary criteria: keeping your attention. The more attention, the more data. And so that obviously is going to have huge behavioral impacts on people, right? You're sucked into devices and systems that are really, dopamine. They're influencing the dopamine reception, like car crashes do that. We all look at car crashes, but should we be looking at car crashes all the time? Probably not a good idea. As an example, if you looked at Trump videos on YouTube and you looked at what the recommendation system would suggest after, it would be like neo-Nazi stuff or white supremacist stuff. So it gets more and more extreme because more extreme stuff keeps people's attention.
We've got a bias to click and to like things that are far from the normal thing, right? So extreme opinions. I would like to go a little bit more into, the impact that the tech has on our regimes and democracies, right? So we've seen that because people live in information bubbles, I just mentioned, debates also are getting much more polarized, right? Because
exactly what I was just about to say. The impact of this YouTube phenomenon is people get more and more polarized. And actually, in reality, we find, including in America, people are actually much more similar. They actually agree on a lot of progressive issues, healthcare, education, these things. But the technologies are amplifying divisiveness and polarization.
Yeah, and we already see the consequences. It's already here. Like we've seen it in Brazil, we've seen it in the US with the election of Trump. In UK with the Brexit.
In India, we see it with Narendra Modi. We've seen this in many places with Brexit, Cambridge Analytica. I had a lot of contact with them off the record while writing this new book.
So there is already kind of a pattern, and we're just starting to grasp it, right? To understand the consequences of it, but. I mean, what is really going on? What is the impact on that tech overall is having on democracies, and what are the risks, in not being able to agree on anything, even what's real and what's not, because we're at that point now.
Yes. Well, huge risks, right? Because the foundations of a democracy or a public sphere, right, is really based on the idea of multiple publics, people from different backgrounds all coming together and openly communicating their voices and their visions. That's what democracy isn't just like voting, right? Democracy is about the ability to listen and voice different opinions and come together based on difference. But what are the technologies doing, right? They're amplifying, they're putting us in these silos, right? The term they call walled gardens or echo chambers, right? They're actually putting us in worlds where we almost don't experience any reality outside of perspectives that are maybe similar to ourselves or maybe even more extreme than ourselves, right? So this shakes political systems, and this is why misinformation and false but also sensationalist information becomes the norm. Because again, the engineers in these companies and the executives, I highly doubt their goal was to destroy democratic systems, but their goal was to build systems that people constantly use, right? And the algorithms are optimized for that, right? So my point is not to disparage algorithms or even disparage these people, but to understand, we have to understand how this shakes the foundations of our society. And these terms that people think are like nice, cute terms like disruption or innovation, we really should think carefully. Who is disrupting what? Who's impacted by what? Especially the most marginalized and vulnerable people. We see, for example, facial recognition systems. This is very timely and maybe of interest to the listeners. Facial recognition systems built by companies like Amazon are being sold to ICE, Immigration Custom Enforcement. Donald Trump, right? They're sending ICE agents with body cameras to look for undocumented people, and they're rounding them up and they're deporting them. But those systems are producing false positives. They're identifying people as undocumented who actually aren't because of, again, the bias of how the systems are built and the fact that in America, the mugshots of people are almost always black and brown people.
It's like you decide what the present and the future based on the past, right? Which is never true.
Like Minority Report.
With the biases.
Right? Or like I have a chapter in my new book called Brave New Digital World from Aldous Huxley's book, sure. Right? Yeah.
So then you have artificial intelligence also that's developing and spreading, right? So we will soon have algorithms everywhere running things for us, deciding things for us. Like this is already happening, like it's helping legal decisions, etc. So
there's some discussion in the US about possibly granting personhood, citizenship to AI systems. It's incredible.
So what are the risks, inherent to this new reality? We're starting to discuss it, but we can go a little bit further. Like, that if we say that technology cannot be neutral and technology will decide everything, who gets to decide how this algorithm works, and what are
almost nobody. And in many cases, and some of the people I interviewed in Silicon Valley are even telling me that they themselves don't really understand why the algorithms make the decisions they do. The algorithms are recursive and they're learning from themselves and learning from one another. But there's a huge issue here, which is that these algorithms and AI systems that you just mentioned are invisible and they're embedded. Do you understand that point? So like in smart cities, Internet of Things, in our courtrooms in America, in our policing systems, they are being informed by our AI systems that are full of these biases and full of these problems. But we the public don't even know when we're interacting with an AI system, right? It's like fair enough if you could see the system, see how it works, be able to change it, be able to modify it. But actually what we're having is an invisible form of social algorithmic engineering. And when these systems are invisibly embedded, they're going to take the biases that, you and I see right now, and they're going to make it much, much worse.
And because also we had that belief, that cultural belief that it's actually better than human beings, right? And that belief also is being promoted by some people, that are making this technology. So again, how likely actually do you see things changing in a good way? Because how likely, will the big tech companies decide to develop tech that's really good for people and really help people living better lives and society to work better? Isn't there kind of the structural issue here related to where these people come from, the cultural biases, but also the business models?
Yeah, it's the business models as well. And one quick point I want to make is, you made a great point in saying that people trust engineered systems as somehow neutral or efficient because people treat technology as morally neutral, and they see like a racist judge. And they say, oh, the technology is going to be better. It's the wrong comparison. The question is not about a racist judge. The question is, what's the right kind of justice system, and how do we make sure the technologies support that, just like the judges should support that.
So it's getting back to the basic roots, the basic questions, right? Which we're not doing.
Precisely. And we see this also economically, right? With this massive transfer of wealth. 7 families have equivalent wealth to 3.9 billion people. In America, 3 families have equivalent wealth to half the population. It's incredible. 195 million. You guys are much better here in Europe. So you guys can lead the way on these issues. But to your main point, to the question you asked, definitely, the goal of a private company, is to grow as much as possible. If a CEO of a company says, "Hey, I don't want to do things. I want to do things that might challenge the profitability a little bit, just because it's better to do that," he'll be fired or she'll be fired, and the next day someone else will come. So that's why there's a lot of things we can do. We need policy frameworks. We need competitive market alternatives. We need social movements and political movements, and we need, more than anything, for people to have this kind of, through podcasts like yours, which I'm grateful for, people need to have this public literacy. They need to be able to stand up and say, hey, we cannot socially engineer a world that supports the 1/10 of the 1% and leaves the rest of us like in the dark, right? We see Uber drivers, for example, making $4 to $5 an hour, 1/3 of a living wage in the US, no benefits, no unionization. This is the logic of private corporate, massive corporate ideology in influencing, I would say even infecting technology. But they can do better, and some of these companies are getting a lot of pushback. Even the employees of these companies are not happy with some of this stuff. So I do have a lot of hope that this stuff can be changed. And I gave a lot of examples today in my talk about that. So please share that with your listeners.
Well, and we see also what Facebook has been facing and how it's being challenged.
It gives us an opportunity, scholars like myself. Remember, I'm a former engineer, but now I'm very much a social scientist and a critic, right? But I'm not a critic who just wants to be negative. I want to talk about what we can do moving forward.
Sure. So we have these, big global issues that we'll have to face collectively. Right? There's the climate crisis is one, and not just the climate, like the natural crisis. But we also have, like as you mentioned, a rising inequality at a global level. So these are becoming not just domestic issues, but also global issues. How can technology, help addressing these issues when today it seems to be reinforcing our, these, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, so one example actually of technology in a great way engaging with climate change issues is not just with monitoring kinds of issues. We also see that with human rights issues, like technology is being used to expose abuses and so on. But also because what we see happening in a few cases, it's not huge yet, is people building digital networks that are community-based, so that they can respond to climate change disasters. So I'll give you an example. In New York City, after the Hurricane Sandy, Superstorm Sandy, they called it, in parts of Brooklyn, they had a network. In Red Hook, it was a mesh network. It was a community network that allowed people to figure out how to do relief very quickly right after the storm. They were able to communicate with one another, share resources, identify one another, and that was a local network, right? So internet networks and global networks can also be supported in this image, but more than anything, we need to let communities take greater power over these technologies.
Okay. So that there is, see where it's going. Like to finish on that,
And I'll also say this: renewable energy sources and green energy sources are also really important in influencing the technologies of tomorrow. And this is like this thing about this fourth industrial revolution. It's a bit of a buzz term that people are using here at this conference, and last year they used it too. So that's also really important, right? These automation systems, we have to think about the grid and the problem of energy loss and climate emissions, carbon emissions. And we have the green and renewable energy sources, and those are really central to this challenge. And remember, the digital world, there's this myth that it doesn't waste energy. It's ridiculous. So sending an email consumes a lot of energy also, because the data on our servers, the global internet is a huge energy block, just like blockchain technologies, right? Like Bitcoin mining, huge energy effect.
So it's making these people more accountable in somehow, and find out ways to address these biases.
And we need like full stack mentality, right? Like we have to start by thinking about energy itself before we start thinking about hardware, software, interfaces, institutions. It's a full stack issue.
Yeah. Systemic issue, right?
Systemic issue.
So, and to end with that question, what can we do at an individual level to improve things? And is it about changing our relationship with technology to start with?
I think so. I think it's about mindfulness, right? Like being aware that the world that is ordered for you, if you will, like the archaeology of knowledge, like Michel Foucault wrote about, like that ordering of the world is not a neutral world, right? And so I think we need to engage with technologies with a little bit of mindfulness. We should see them as tools that are serving private corporate overlords, and maybe us in a way. We should take things with a little bit of a grain of salt, and we should also trust other sources. We shouldn't just blindly accept the digital world as it's fed to us, because otherwise we're breaking apart, we're fragmenting. We're fragmenting the best things about us as human beings, which is like compassion, collectivity, cooperation, profit, and private value is fine, but it shouldn't come at the cost of our basic humanity. And that's really what I was trying to say today. Like, it's time to really restore and focus on humanity, human values, the best of us as humans, and make sure these technologies serve that. I have no problem with any technology. I'm agnostic about technology, but we have to first and foremost remember techne, right? It starts with this expression of the human. Humans create these technologies. They don't create us, right? It's not Terminator yet.
So put the human in the center again.
Human in the center.
Thanks all for your time, Ramesh.
Oh, I really enjoyed it. Thank you. Thank you for having me.